I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Larry Hancock, a well-known UAP researcher, author, and board member of the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. Larry brings his formal training in history and cultural anthropology to his research and writing on Cold War history and national security topics. He also writes extensively about the UFO UAP phenomena. He's a graduate of the University of New Mexico, earned a BA with honors, majoring in history, cultural anthropology, and education. Following service in the U.S. Air Force, his career in computers, communications, and technology marketing gave him the opportunity to become involved with and consult on strategic analysis and planning studies. Larry is the author of 7 books on topics in national defense and UFO history, and joins us today to discuss the New Jersey drone sightings and Jake Barber's recent NewsNation interview with Ross Coulthart on UAP. Larry, welcome back, sir. It is a pleasure and honor to have you with me, as always. Always an honor.
It's great to be back with you, Tim. Looking forward to the chat.
I am especially pleased to have you with me because you have, number one, you have the national security background to be able to comment on these whistleblower allegations, right, as well as the drone sightings. But also you have the UFO experience and that intersectionality between the two, to be able to bring those two together and offer insightful comments on, we have lots of breaking news stuff going on. So let's get started with the New Jersey drone mystery. Drones have been sighted across the eastern seaboard. I've counted over 35 locations, including sensitive military installations. Dr. Kevin Newth, just yesterday, told me that he has seen sightings in over 17 countries. So this is a real issue, a real mystery, and authorities at every level express amazement, dismay, and no resolutions for it. What are your thoughts?
And to an extent, especially the East Coast, reminds me historically of the wave of 1952, which was all up and down the East Coast. The difference being in those cases, the UFOs primarily were reported from major metropolitan areas. This is different. This isn't metropolitan areas. This is primarily locations adjacent to military or government facilities of one type or the other. There have been some descriptions of drones near atomic power plants, but it's not strategic military locations either, other than the fact that they're on the Northeast Corridor, which is kind of all strategic, but and was considered that way all the way since the beginning of the Cold War. But so it's like historically 52, but unlike in terms of the locations and the frequency. There are more drones being seen at a single time. That seems to be one of the real identifiers for this wave, if you will. People are seeing multiple drones, not what you would call drone swarms. I mean, that's the other big difference. We've had some real national security issue with drone swarms over our Navy task groups that deployed off San Diego, off the East Coast. That appeared to be very different. That was really literally a drone swarm, lots of drones, 15 to 20 over a day, a night. You know, that's different than what we're seeing here. So it's alike and unalike in ways, but it's makes it really different is the government is not. The government always, of course, wants to control the narrative. But in this case, it's not trying to control the narrative. That's probably the most surprising thing to me. Usually, the Air Force or Homeland or somebody would step into this and at least create a narrative. And they really haven't. They have left it to the media, which is strange. And it suggests either they do know what's going on, and it's troublesome, because if they were to seize the narrative in that extent, they would have to give a rational explanation, and they didn't do that. A rational explanation other than misidentifications, which clear, as usual, is about 80%. That's true, but that's the other thing that differentiates it, as far as I'm seeing.
Well, Larry, this rash of sightings comes at a time of incredibly heightened international tensions. I mean, the U.S. and Russia, it felt like we were right on the edge of nuclear war, 3 weeks ago. And then, bam, there it was. The drone sightings started. Now, the U.S. and Russia have been involved before with nuclear brinksmanship, and it seems like on numerous occasions when you get these showdowns, UFO sightings spike. This has happened before, right?
It has happened before, and one of the things that's happening now, certainly in Europe, but with Russia, is the number of incursions of, jamming and aircraft intercepts of surveillance aircraft. It's kind of brinksmanship in a way. The Russians are really widely deploying interference with GPS and various location systems. But what seems more interesting to me in this case is, and we've only had one instance, and it's great. It made the news for like 24 hours, and then it went away. And I always love it when that sort of thing happens, like, wait a minute, where's the rest of the story, and is there a bigger story? And that was a report of a Chinese national taken by security, FBI, somebody boarding an airplane out of the U.S., and a drone was recovered in his possession. Now, how they knew to look for him, is there a bigger story there? Historically, I would say in this instance, I'm actually more tempted to speculate that this might be, I wouldn't call it a brinksmanship, but a type of strategic propaganda effort to raise the stakes on national security and homeland defense, sort of like, again, as I say, speculation, but right now most of our confrontations that are really right on the brink are in the South China Sea. Off the Philippines, off Taiwan, not so much Russia. They're playing games, okay, but where it could get bad any given afternoon is in the South China Sea. And one would have to wonder if the Chinese aren't demonstrating to us, sort of like, don't worry about the South China Sea if you can't protect your East Coast. Is there a message that's being telegraphed?
That could be a form of, I believe what they call that is signaling.
Yes.
Now, the drones do fit the parameters of existing technology. People have said that they've measured up to 6 feet wide in a wingspan, but they're agricultural drones that measure that. They've said that they have a loiter time measured in hours, but there are hybrid gasoline-electric drones that can do that. There are stories, however, of the drones interfering with camera electronics as well as disabling other drones that are sent up to investigate. So do you put any credence in those reports? Because that could be just, it could be just bad equipment, it could be normal malfunctions, or it could be something more sophisticated.
Well, we absolutely know from the ramping up of drone warfare in Ukraine that weaponized drones are being built of that size now, and of that range, hundreds of miles range, and they do carry jammers. You can put a jammer on them, and certainly the Chinese would have the ability to do that. So the drones that really concern me out of all this are the ones that you just described, the ones that are of considerable size, comparable to some of the weaponized drones that are being used in that warfare. And we know the Chinese are very active in drone construction. There's a strong suspicion that drone swarm off San Diego came off a leased China carrier ship.
Okay.
And so I've seen nothing really that looks anomalous as we would normally think of the UAP, UFO environment. These look like actually not hobbyist drones, a couple of steps above. I mean, the 80% may be hobbyist drones, but there's a 10%, 5% that are more serious. And those are the ones that concern me. And that is, again, I noticed that nobody in the military or Homeland, especially Homeland, like Homeland has been totally silent. It really should not be the Air Force that responds to this to some extent. but where's Homeland Security? And they're invisible. But they should be the ones that should be parsing that out and really kind of dialing down on what's a concern and what isn't. We're doing none of the things that we would have done during the Cold War. Spotter teams, just none of that is happening. It's kind of like we want to ignore it. And that's strange.
Well, and one of my concerns, and I think a lot of people have this concern, right, is that foreign powers could be taking advantage of the UAP UFO phenomena to basically blend in and do reconnaissance and, Lord knows what else. I mean, we have had instances that we know of foreign reconnaissance, right? The Chinese spy balloons were one example of that. And the U.S. government did take action there. So it's not unreasonable to think that, if we're on the lookout for balloons now, and from what I understand, we did recalibrate our radar systems to look for those,
yes,
that someone who wants to do reconnaissance would be finding a different path. And perhaps that's drones.
Although I have to say, personally, I like the thought of I don't like it, but the thought of the signaling strikes me more so in that if you want to do reconnaissance, photo reconnaissance, satellite, lidar data doesn't make any difference anymore. Resolution down to a couple of feet or better from low Earth orbit. The Chinese have got tons of imaging satellites in orbit now. They can pretty much see what they want to see anytime they want to see it. What they can't do is make that personal. This is making that personal. It's scaring people. People are writing their congresspersons. If you think about it, if the call gets strong enough, how do we deal with this? We're going to have to invest a huge amount of money in anti-drone systems for Homeland Security. And this time we can't just put it around, atomic ICBM bases, because they're demonstrating they can be anywhere in the infrastructure. And 3 or 4 drones swarming a power station. One of the questions I really have is there telegraphing a message that says,
Yes.
we're bringing this to your attention. You got a choice. You either back off or you better get ready to initiate a totally new homeland drone defense system that's going to cost you billions and billions of dollars.
Well, and again, China and Russia are both moving forward very rapidly in the drone world, so that is a distinct possibility. Let's get into Jake Barber's NewsNation interview with Ross Coulthart. So helicopter pilot Jake Barber claims that he helped recover downed UAP on a test site called The Range. Barber is a decorated U.S. Air Force veteran and former member of an elite combat control unit, and he described recovering both egg and what he calls an 8-gon-shaped UAP. So have you seen that interview now, and what are your thoughts on it starting out?
I've seen it. I've watched it a couple of times. I get one of the fascinating things is in terms of UAPs and UFOs, I didn't see anything new. After I looked at it a couple of times, it's like, okay, back in the 1950s, for 3 or 4 or 5, 6 years, we had people supposedly telepathically contacting alien spacecraft and in communications with them, landing at certain spots to make contact with them. That part's not really new. I mean, the thought, although it was presented as if that were something new and striking, but it's not really. If anything else, it would be continuity. The shapes of the objects, the size of the objects, the size of that egg-shaped object is not unlike the one from Socorro, New Mexico, back in the 60s. Actually, it's pretty close. What I saw in the video appeared to be considerably smaller. Apparently, if it's being lifted by that helicopter, which is not a heavy lift helicopter, the one that shows in the footage. In any event, but so one of the things, immediate observation, is the content in terms of UFOs and UAPs, contact with them, is not strikingly new. The other thing that struck me after looking at it is I wish there had been more interview content rather than show. because clearly it wasn't simply an interview. It was a staged presentation with a lot of outtakes, a lot of extra footage, kind of, presenting the positioning of the whistleblower. You really didn't need all of that once you had his basic resume, which is basically a combat air controller, not really a tier 1 operator that we think of, a SEAL or a Delta Force type. But, aside from that, a lot of it was presentation rather than content. So what I'm lacking so far is, where is the range? And is it a government range or a corporate private range? I mean, we do know that some of the aircraft corporations, aerospace, operate their own ranges. They're usually fairly limited in scale. We don't know, for that matter, that these days some of them have sites for drone testing, for example. So I'm really unable, after watching the whole thing, to parse out what was government and what was corporate, because apparently he left government service, left the Air Force, and became a contractor to one or more corporations. Now, supposedly, the show presented the fact that he had gone to Washington, met with congresspersons, met with committees, with AARO. I'm still trying to I don't know if you've determined it. I'm still trying to determine if that happened. I don't know, or if he presented any write-ups.
Yeah, and so if I could jump in a little bit, I can fill in at least a few of the blanks. So the NewsNation interview itself said that the camera team, right, or Ross Coulthart, accompanied him when he did testify before the Senate Intelligence Committee. So I believe he has testified under oath, according to what they've said. The egg itself measured about 20 feet long, had no visible propulsion system or thermal signature, and at least to me is reminiscent of the propane tank-shaped UAP from the Nimitz encounters. I thought that was very interesting. As I mentioned to Kevin Newth on our interview, to me it seems like a really amazing pressure vessel, right? So in terms of space applications for use in different atmospheres and oceans and things like that, it seems like that would fit really well. The egg is very interesting, though, because that shape has been really neglected in ufology for many years. It's in a lot of the older sightings, but I mean, it's been, saucers and black triangles forever now, right?
That and orbs, but physically, saucers and black. So that's kind of a return. That's almost like a return of the telepathic contact, which has been missing for quite a while now. So that's almost like a return. It's like, are they back? But one of the things that I saw in the footage, again, that and by the way, if you run across his testimony, that's kind of what I'm looking for. Because one of the things I want to see if it was it all an open session or some enclosed session. Because what we really want to hear is what corporations employed him, for how long, what was the timing like, where was this range, and I'm sure, that's the kind of detail I would have expected to be required.
I think that's all closed session. I think that's all closed session. There was nothing on C-SPAN. I didn't see any, this interview was where the story broke. And from what I understand, there is more forthcoming, but I don't think we're going to see details like that. That takes me to another question. I'm going to jump around on my list here because one of the things that troubles me is Jake Barber joins a growing list of whistleblowers who are adding data to what is effectively a black box, right? Now, I mean, the whole idea of testifying in front of Congress is to get your information on the record. But if they put that under lock and key and nobody's able to get it, I mean, what's the point, right? It's locked up, it's classified, it's completely hidden from public view. And as we know with JFK, and you and I are talking about doing a JFK interview later this month, I mean, that stuff has been classified for, 60, 70 years now? So what's the point of even doing it if it's just written down, put in a box, and then locked up? And that troubles me.
Oh, that troubles me a lot. And it would undermine two things. First, he and all of these folks do have now legal protection. I mean, law was passed, Congress passed law. They have legal protection, and that they can't, for what they've revealed. So from that standpoint, we're past the issue of them being concerned about that part, you know.
Yeah.
Then the question is, if they give something to AARO, or they give something to government, not so much. If they give something to a body that could classify it and doesn't, then it's public, you know. But then the body that classifies it legally is obligated to say they did that, you know. So this could be unraveled over time. You can't have somebody testify to you and give you information that you classify and then not admit that it's classified. So those questions are going to be raised on that point. The other point that troubles me a great deal is AARO is obligated to report back by law on each one of these people. They have to acknowledge that they interviewed them. They have to acknowledge that they talked about something, and then they have to give a position statement. They have to say, yeah, we evaluated A, B, and C reports from it, and here's our analysis. I mean, they maybe don't have to get, but they have to respond. Just like, you know, when they announce that they've reviewed a particular incident, they're obligated to provide their report as to why they found it was either, you know, unexplained or explainable. So they are required. They can't get away with that forever, you know, legally.
So I think he did. I believe he did submit reports to Arrow as well. So it's possible that at least some kind of feedback may be forthcoming then.
And we should be able to request it. I mean, and the congresspersons. It sounds like he should be involved. There's certainly one or more Congress people involved with what he's saying. So they should absolutely have the right to appeal to and raise the issue. So I guess the point is, it looks like there's a black box right now, but there are venues to crack it open longer term based on what he's saying.
Okay. So I want to get into the other shape. Again, there was the egg. We saw the video footage of that, about 20 feet long. It was being suspended on a 150-foot long line from a helicopter while it was being transported. Barber also described what I believe is being called an 8-gon as a disc-shaped craft, if I understand correctly, with 8 sections. And when they were doing the recovery operation, he reported a profound emotional experience he described as psionic in nature. And so I wanted to ask you about that. Again, we're going back into psychic territory here, and it's interesting because this comes out of early reports, right? As well as the radiation sickness. Both of those are things that other people have reported.
Both of those are things, especially the radiation. And again, just in regard to that, another thing I would love to see, supposedly, according to the Russ's interview, there is a doctor who has his medical reports, right? And went into some great extent. Those medical reports have to show some detail, and I'm sort of surprised they would have to show who he was working for, who paid for the treatment, you know, what the treatment was. That is not controlled. I mean, he has that in his hands, and hopefully he will share it, because that would tell us the date, you know, the location, a lot of details about that radiation incident. So that's got to be out there, and hopefully somebody would provide it, because that's a big key to the detail, because as you say, I would say right at the moment there are 2 or 3 what I would call indicator effects that help differentiate from one hypothetical type of UAP propulsion to another. You know, that's something the team I'm involved with is looking right now. You know, how could you differentiate different types of UAP propulsion? Is it
okay?
You know, is it a plasma toroid? Is it a, you know, whatever? And that would be of great help for us. As much as I hate to say it, that kind of radiation effect is data collection. Painful as it may be, it is data collection in terms of the intensity and type of radiation. What he described, you know, is probably not gamma, but it's probably X-ray, and that, you know, he's almost a frequency meter in himself from that experience.
You know, there was, I'm not clear about this also. This kind of came to mind after I watched the interview, and I'm sure I'll kind of unravel this part of it myself. But if I remember correctly, he described this this powerful, psychic experience, and he described an overwhelming and profound sadness and things like that, but not a warning, right? Not like
Right.
stay away, you're going to get sick. And yet, if I understand this correctly, that same experience that he had, that he said was like so beautiful, it was life changing, led to him getting incredibly sick. And that makes
Yeah.
me
Yeah.
wonder, right? You have to ask big questions. Maybe E.T. didn't know that he would get sick, or was this some kind of a trap where they didn't care? I mean, it's
Or
hard
so-
to tell.
Yeah, or somebody. What strikes me, and we've had, there may well be an effect between the radiation and that effect. We do know
Okay.
from neuropsychology that radiation at the right frequencies and intensities, it's not exactly like LSD, but it does affect the cortex, and generates a lot of entangled emotions, not communications, just like, you're kind of all over the place. You're crying at one time, it's like a trip. Okay?
It may not have been communication at all. It may have been the onset of acute radiation poisoning, and he just simply wasn't aware of it.
And he wasn't briefed on it, or someone wasn't expecting it. It's one of the things that stands out about all of this is it's kind of hard to differentiate this from the stuff he describes picking up routinely in testing from these incidents, and they're not decoupled. He has missions, but we don't know, do they not give them special instructions for different kinds of missions? It's kind of like, I have to say I was a little nonplussed when we watched the footage of the egg. We saw it being sat down on the ground, take it and dropped out of a sling and roll around, right? It's like, wait a minute, do you really do that with an unknown, possibly alien technology? Take better care of it than that. Could you, land it on something soft at least? But it's hard to differentiate how he was briefed differently on different missions. He talks about carrying the box, where did nobody know what was in the box? Did they not? I think I'd almost, if I were him, he doesn't seem to hold any grudges against his employer, but given what he went through, it's like, wait a minute, you guys could at least have given us some kind of warning of this was hazardous material, or did they not know? That's hard, but because there's no sign of overt messaging in the communications, it is just like a general emotional effect. That makes me wonder if it really isn't physics oriented. There's some, rather than an entity, because it also appears that there are not any entities involved with these objects that he's picking up and carrying.
And what you're saying there is, from the interview at least, we didn't see any indication that he saw NHIs. He didn't mention seeing grays or anything like that. He did mention feeling profound emotions, feeling a connection. He talked about psychic, psionic effects, but we didn't see any evidence. And so with the egg itself, also, I mean, to be honest, it looks weird, but there's, it doesn't have made on Planet X stamped on it. So it's impossible to tell what that was.
No insignia. If it only had the same insignia that we saw out at Socorro, this is good. All right, but no, unfortunately it didn't.
Well, let me dig into the psionics aspect of this. So Jake Barber claims there is a psionics team utilizing people with special abilities who were able to summon UAP. Apparently, at least if this example is representative of it, they summon the craft and then maybe this corporation picks the craft up. I don't understand exactly how that's supposed to work. He talked about, again, sustaining those medical injuries consistent with radiation exposure. So there's some strange stuff going on here, and psychic powers, right, are involved with it. I wanted to ask what your thoughts were on that. I know there are tons of people in groups and even organizations out there doing what they call remote viewing, right? And different levels of following those protocols. I mean, there were protocols that were put in place with the Stargate program and stuff back in the 60s, 70s. I mean, do you think that this could be just some one-off, or is it official?
The thing is that type again, all the way going back to the 50s. We have numerous incidents of groups getting together and attempting telepathic contact and saying that they've had it. We have
Yeah.
numerous incidents of them asking aliens or visitors to show up, and a UFO shows up, at least briefly. There's one fascinating incident that it's kind of troubling. Is in Washington D.C., some high-ranking people inside the intelligence community got in touch with this older lady who said, "Look, I just have to think about them and they come." And they laughed at her, and then actually she demonstrated it for them, and everybody went berserk. It's like, wait a minute.
Okay.
And there are roots of this kind of psionic contact going back a long way. And it's gone on intermittently. There is a group called Star Watch. Over the following decades, there were groups of people who actually, would get together at night and concentrate, and sometimes UFOs would, or something seen as a UFO would be seen. Kind of the same thing that we saw in the interview footage. It would be a light in the sky or a couple of lights in the sky. Nothing lands. There's no, communication, but it's if they call something and something came, which is kind of what he's describing. The interesting thing about it, the way he describes it is, he even manages to somehow recruit one of these people into this private team that he is currently running. It's unclear whether these would be people that would have been contract employees for a corporation, on the range. I still would really like to know whether this is a government range or a corporate range, and,
Well, And I believe someone somewhere along the way used the word ontological shock, right? Which is I'm just perpetually in ontological shock now. It's a lot of this stuff. It's intellectually, it's able to be understood, but like on an emotional level, the idea of people using some kind of psychic channeling to summon a UAP and then say, give me your UFO, we want to do tests on it. I struggle with that, right? And I think that makes me pretty normal, to be honest. But
I think I've been doing this too long, because I kind of agree with his statement, I must admit. And when he said, well, I'm not sure it will be an ontological shock, it'll be another kind of shock. But there's been so much of this, so much in the media, entertainment industry, so on and so forth. I'm not even sure anymore if they did land and say, take me to your leader, that it would just be another day's in the Situation Room, okay, aliens land somewhere. But one of the things, what he described, the emotional experience, again, has been described over and over again when these high psych haulings occur. People do, it's an emotional event, whether it's coming from inside, outside, it's experiential. It's like, we called them, they came, and, now I really feel weird. What's causing this?
Well, that doesn't necessarily have to be psychic. I mean, if you're face to face with a non-human entity, a non-human intelligence, right? You have that proof where all of a sudden it becomes real. You're looking at the craft. I think anyone would experience profound emotions. That doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be psychic, but potentially it is.
Yeah, that's where it's hard to, and you would, again, I think what strikes me is that he describes something that appears to be fairly structured. I mean, there's a core of these people, you can call on them. This is an experiment that appears to be, it's kind of like the remote viewing experiments, which Hal Puthoff was associated with, which were conducted in a very rigorous fashion. This wasn't just playing around. I would expect at this point in time, that this is being conducted in a structured fashion, and one almost has to wonder, are we more interested in what that technique is, or what they're doing, or the technology? It may be as much one as with the other, which leads me back to the tough books that he refers to in the interview that were planted out somewhere. Now where they were planted, that footage, I don't know if that was. I assume that was redone. That wasn't
Yeah,
original.
I believe the tough book aspect, I think that was a recreation,
Yeah.
but the way that was framed was, if I understand that correctly, they came to feel like that was a setup,
Yeah.
right? They became the plausible deniability. So somebody put them in the lake to make them hunt for it, and guess who's, getting the short end of the stick?
And that's where they lost me. I have to admit. I think that I've been playing around with covert ops and all of these games and triple plays and whatever, and I can't fathom the cause for that. It's almost, someone said, do we really have two corporate players fighting each other? Is one corporation trying to steal data from another corporation and they want to get rid of this team? Is this team unique? Is it the government versus a corporation? And by the way, they didn't take the tough books. They just took the disc. It's like, why would you just take the disc? And let somebody become suspicious of what's going on. That last part is where I really kind of got lost in, because I don't know who the players are. If we knew,
Yeah.
if we knew who the players were, maybe we could deal with it. But I wasn't quite sure why he felt, or they felt, other than the gunshots later apparently. And I didn't quite capture, were they being shot at? Did they just hear a gun? But that's so disconnected at that point. I just honestly can't. I can't tell who the players are, and if I can't see who the players are, I don't know what the motives might be.
Well, I'm going to segue into statistics briefly, and I have to kind of go from memory, but I believe it's something like 35 to 38% of Americans believe that UFOs are extraterrestrial craft. Something like 65 to 70% of Americans believe that the U.S. government at least knows more than they're telling us, right? And actually, it probably should be 100%, because I think the government has told us that there are things they're not telling us, So we've got that, but then the other statistic that is really important to me is right now, only 22% of Americans believe that the U.S. government is trying to do the right thing most of the time. Not even all the time, just most of the time trying to do the right thing, right? And that number is up from 17%, I think, a couple of years ago. So what that says is, as Americans, we don't trust our government. We think they lie to us, we think they're doing bad things, and we think that it's endemic. And I'm wondering if things like this story that Jake Barber is relaying just feed into that fear, uncertainty, and doubt about our own elected government.
And if you really push me to the extreme, I might say I am worried that we have psychological warfare in play. I'm worried that we have, for several years now, have adversarial players who really understand social dynamics, who understand social media, and understand really dirty psychological warfare. I wrote a book called Creating Chaos, which talks about political warfare. And one of the first steps in any effective political warfare is to make a population totally distrustful of its government. That's how you set the stage for revolutions, government change, coups, whatever. And I'm not sure that we could not, some of this could not be manipulation. Can't prove it, but it certainly fits the model. Anything
so that would be manipulation by a foreign adversary.
Correct.
That's what you're suggesting,
yes.
Right?
Okay. Distrust, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. FUD is the basic protocol for doing this, which is exactly what's happening. And you have to wonder if there aren't two players in. We have the physical phenomena, like the drones that we're talking about, that make you uncertain, and then we have the actual propaganda element of people that may be perfectly serious about what they're saying, and the government gets caught in between. It doesn't know what to say, so what is the result? Fear, uncertainty, and doubt, escalating constantly, and nobody trusts. By the time you get to the end, if the government does tell you the truth, you won't believe it.
Well, one of the things, and this would be another potential explanation, is something that I've heard about in the past they call the grand tour. And the idea is that if you have some kind of a UFO conspiracy, if someone gets too close to it, right, there are a couple of different ways to shut them up. You could either kill them, right? And in this case, Jake Barber alludes to the fact that he was afraid for his life. I believe some of his team members have suggested the same thing. They've said, look, it's enough to intimidate them so that they think they're going to be killed. You don't even have to outright say it. That's one way. The other way is this grand tour. And I haven't heard this mentioned much recently, but the idea was instead of hurting them or intimidating them or killing them, they say, okay, well, we'll show you. We'll show you exactly what's going on, right? They take them to a secret facility. They show them JFK in life support. They show them Hitler's head in a jar. They show them alien bodies. And then they say, go, tell anybody you want,
Oh, I think you're right on that, Tim. In fact, if I had to weigh what I just said about political warfare versus this grand tour thing, the reason the grand tour stands out to me is we know that it's been done before. Project Beta is a great book about how the U.S. Air Force essentially drove a engineer, physicist, consultant to the Air Force crazy with a story about underground caverns and reptilians, and he had collected actual data on a Star Wars, actually adaptive astronomy lensing for better satellite resolution, but it involves transmitted signals, light patterns, and he thought it was aliens out at Sandia Base. Well, actually what it was a super secret project. But when he reported it to the Air Force, they gave him the grand tour. They brought him on base. They started giving him equipment. They started giving him recordings.
Yeah.
They fed him information. This has happened before. And one of the alternatives that I would offer, and this is, again, wild speculation. I always try to, I need a flashcard that says wild speculation, is that experiments have been going on with advanced technology for decades now. They really haven't gotten it to work yet for whatever reason. They've got it to work, but not viably for military or commercial purposes. But every once in a while, you've got to plant enough information so that people think it's aliens. People think it's something they don't understand, so you give them this grand tour. Maybe sometimes it's just one or two people, but we know that during the 80s and 90s, a fellow named Moore actually joined as a UFO, with APRO as a UFO researcher, joined into one of these programs and infiltrated groups and spread stories of a truly sensational nature that he was being fed as a trade-off for the real information which he never got. So we know that these kind of games are played, and we know they're played within the intelligence community. So I can't exclude that people that were actually involved in recoveries, transport, some kind of logistics effort, if they showed some sign, like let's just say that they got burned in an incident, and medically damaged and maybe resented it, maybe whatever, one might just set them up by putting them in a place where they would start telling really sensational things that nobody would believe and compromise themselves for anything else. That's a dirty game that's been played more than once.
Yeah. I think it is very important to keep in mind that there are a lot of psychological elements to this, and it doesn't necessarily mean that that's what happened, but there is that question hanging out there. And I think that the great tragedy is that, this individual, Jake Barber, is a U.S. veteran. I believe he's a decorated combat veteran, right? The people who were on his team, this recovery team, if I understand correctly, they are veterans, or at least most of them are. These are people that we should be treating with the utmost respect and dignity. They have risked their lives for our country. And no matter how you view this, no matter what lens you look at this through, he is being manipulated and taken advantage of, right? He's either being used as a mouthpiece to spread propaganda and lies, or he was, accidentally wrapped up in something that severely damaged his health and then potentially became the target of an assassination attempt. No matter how you look at that, it is really not appropriate.
Yeah, in truth, one of two things. He's either being manipulated purposefully, and it's dirty and it's nasty and it's happened before, because you do that to people that are trustworthy. You don't manipulate people that don't have any confidence level. They don't do you any good.
Yeah.
They're no threat. Nobody believes them anyway. Like, I just sat down and met with a spacecraft from Pluto. Okay, this is not the kind of person who's a threat to you. You wouldn't play games with them if they were involved in something real. But what we should never have heard from him, because he should be inside the security establishment. He has clearances. He's had clearances in the past. He shouldn't have to go to the media. There is absolutely no reason why he should have to go to the media. He understands classifications. He understands what's secret and what isn't, and you have to assume that he's well-intentioned. So this is an exercise. He shouldn't be at risk. If for some reason, and it would be, with all the data available, it would be easy to assess whether he's at risk from a corporation. Because some of the things I heard, let's say he mentioned the fact that who he was working for had empowered his team to use lethal force. That means some corporation, it sounds like, because corporations told him that if somebody kill him. And that's really actionable from a legal standpoint. So that's a little, but some of the things he's describing, if they happen within corporate America, somebody in corporate America should be in trouble. And the government should be protecting him from that. They should be listening to him.
That takes us into, and that's a whole nother territory. I mean, that could be a whole series of podcasts, but it does take us into this gray world, right? And I think it is important to point out, from what I saw in the interview, he was not an active duty military member while he was engaged in these recovery operations. He was a veteran, a decorated veteran, but working for a private contractor. And that takes us into this gray world, right? And we know that those folks are out there. I mean, on our side, and as well as other major countries. I mean, like Russia had the Wagner Group. There are many other organizations out there where they're paramilitary in nature. They're doing secure military work. They could be engaged in, firefights, assassinations, Lord knows what. But they are not officially sanctioned, and that's part of the idea, right? Is you can cut them off if
and
they're having problems.
They're hiring paramilitary teams. Wait a minute, what? Okay, Brinks, I can understand. Brinks is carrying, armored cars and armed guards, but
yes,
we've got a corporation that's somewhere in the aerospace world, has its own test range, and they're hiring private military contractors, apparently, who are armed, and they're transporting very dangerous materials. You've got to ask, when he describes that crate that gave him the radiation exposure experience, where did that crate go?
That was, and that would have been, when you stop and think about it, so that would have, if they had used it on one of these 150-foot or 250 or 200-foot long lines, that's a pretty significant distance to get that kind of radiation exposure.
Oh,
so
absolutely.
How hot could that thing be?
Yeah.
I mean, what in God's name would create that kind of radiation that far away?
Well, we kind of understand what things have progressed to the point now where one of the big changes in the last 10 years is the fact that the government has started building generators for the Army and the Navy to power laser systems that are really high voltage, big electrical generating systems, and you can do things with them before with lasers that you couldn't do before. You may be able to do things with plasmas in any event that you couldn't do before, and there's a risk. I can accept if this is a government development under normal government protocols and safety regulations. That's one thing. But if the corporations are carrying around something that he described, and this is not the only incident. We had the Cash Landrum thing in Texas, where helicopters were supposedly carrying this thing that was an intense radiation and source, and burned people at a great distance. If we've got corporations that are carrying this sort of stuff around, as you said, on long line, it's sort of insane to even be transporting that sort of thing slung under the kind of helicopter he described. That's not really even a heavy lift transport type helicopter, and it's a single engine. I hate to say this, but normally, if whatever you're transporting is like that, there are other ways to carry it. So why were they doing it? It's at this point in time, I hate to say it, but I'd rather see government personnel doing this than private contractors, especially private military contractors working for corporations. We've had some really bad experiences. No, not denigrating their service or anything, but we've had corporations using private military contractors overseas, and a lot of really bad stuff came out of it. You mentioned the Wagner Group. That concerns me.
Yeah, I think that should concern everyone. And so, something to keep in mind is, in addition to military cover-ups, which are happening to some extent, and again, undermining American public confidence in government, you have this whole gray world, right? And this isn't just UFOs. This is, all sorts of stuff, right? And we heard all sorts of stories coming out of Afghanistan and Iraq and the Middle East during the war there. So there's a whole lot of stuff that's happening kind of behind the scenes. And from what I've heard, one of the reasons that private contractors are used is because government itself can't do some of it, right? It's not legal. It violates the Geneva Convention. It violates the rules of warfare. And so they'll hire somebody who isn't bound by those. So, and that doesn't mean that this individual or his team were breaking any of those rules. But what it could mean is that they were put at risk by the kind of folks who just don't care.
And it sounds like they were briefed logistically, what to pick up, where to go, what to carry it, but they weren't briefed on the risk. I can't believe nothing he said leads me to believe that they were briefed on the risk, and I have to say that that's a disservice to them. Can a private corporation get away with it? Sure. But that's not only a disservice to them, but to everybody else involved, and shows if what he described actually happened, it's a huge safety risk, and it's a huge it undermines faith in what corporate America can do on its own. As you say, it's sort of like we're doing it. Who nodded their head, right? Who nodded their head and said, it's too risky for the government to do it. Why don't you guys do it? Do we think they haven't even informed the government? Did I not inform the government that I've got alien technology with huge radiation emissions? Do we not inform the government at all? You've got people that are doing classified weapons projects. One of the things that really kind of appalls me is the lack of control, apparently, or maybe control's not the right word, but using these people, without briefing them. He sounded like they got very minimal briefing on their missions, even on those tough books and that sort of thing. What kind of mission briefing did you give him? Now, I will also have to say I'm a little bit concerned about the footage that showed him taking his team to Washington, D.C. and confronting somebody, a government, is now, okay, I'm all for them, and I can understand why they'd be paranoid, but, rather than reporting this to anybody, he takes a team to D.C. and goes into what appears to be a government agency, face-to-face with somebody.
I believe, if I remember correctly from the interview, that was the director of security for the corporate group that he was employed by.
I guess that would make me feel a little bit better. Okay, I would. Doesn't make me feel good, but I can see by that time they certainly might have. Especially this is after the radiation burn and everything else. I can see how they would want to do that. Yeah, although certainly I can see at that point in time they made a target of themselves. I'm also, we haven't talked about the last part where they're now operating independently doing skywatch activities with some kind of major private donor support, which I thought was interesting. That that's different. I mean,
I think that we will learn more about that as we go. I think that we'll learn more about that. And so, I mean, these things are evolving stories. That part was kind of towards the end, right? In fact, from what I understand, they actually did some investigation of the New Jersey drones as well.
Yeah.
Although I'm not sure what may or may not have happened there. So we'll have to kind of stay tuned and see what happens as that one breaks. But Larry, for today, let me thank you so much for your time and for your insight. I'm going to drop links to your books in the show notes to this. Again, you have written about national defense and UFOs and the intersectionality between those, where those come together, which is an incredibly important area. And you have the experience and knowledge to be able to speculate effectively on this. So thank you so much. Let me close by asking, what's coming up for you, and which of your books should people be looking at?
Well, at this point in time, I'm spending equal amounts of time in the UFO UAP world, still working with the SCU teams to do new studies. We have a study in peer review. As you know, the peer review process takes 6 to 8 months, so we're 3 or 4 months into that, and we've released 3 papers on UFOs, UAPs, intentions in the military and public domain. We're closing out that series and looking towards some new studies that actually examine propulsion technologies and speculate a bit on origins. So that's new in that venue. Over in my other life, in the Cold War history world, I just issued a new book called The Oswald Puzzle, Lee Harvey Oswald Reexamined. So
yes, and we are going to do an interview on that one. That's on my list.
That's enough for my life at this age. It's kind of like, that's enough. I'm okay.
Okay. Well, Larry, let me thank you again so much for your time today, sir.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Tim.